Hi, this is going to be our last In Focus together for a while. So I wanted to take the time today to take stock over what we've been through and where we're going. All that is coming up on this In Focus. First, today, we saw the release of the last apparently living female hostages being held by Hamas. We had the last IDF female soldier, Agam Berger, who was released along with the last female apparently live civilian hostage, Arad Yehud, and the first male hostage, 80-year-old Gadi Moses, was also released today. There are going to be 3 more hostages released over the weekend. What we saw with the release, first of Agam Berger and then of Arad Yehud and Gadi Moses, is the face of Palestinian society. With Agam Berger, we had another Al Jazeera choreographed, stagecrafted propaganda for Hamas, where they made her stand up on a stage wearing fake uniform, getting a fake certificate from Hamas, and being let off. I think she also got a little baggie of maybe like a goodie bag or whatever to send her off her way while she's surrounded by armed terrorists. Actually, they were holding IDF weapons, apparently, that they had seized in one place or another. At any rate, so that was the first stagecraft that they saw. And then we had the horrible scenes of Arad Yehud and Gadi Moses being released in the face of they're being surrounded by terrorists holding guns, and outside the perimeter of the terrorists, a small circle of terrorists that are with them, they are being beset by a lynch mob of Gazans who want to rip them apart. And you can see here the footage of Arad Yehud. According to the reports, she was sequestered. She was held by the Islamic Jihad and the Salafists in Gaza on her own. The first time that she heard Hebrew spoken to her by another Israeli or at all since October 7th, 2023, was when she met Gadi Moses after they were both brought to the Red Cross, so that she has been completely alone with these terrorists since she was taken from her home in the kibbutz on October 7th until today. And look at what she looks like. She's completely terrified, holding on to an armed terrorist who is the one that's escorting her in a circle of other terrorists, this poor little woman, all by herself, in a sea of Palestinians who want to tear her apart. And I don't know, I can't imagine what she's been through for the past nearly 500 days in captivity in Gaza at the hands of these monsters. And now she's being freed, and God willing, she's going to recover from everything that she's suffered, and she's going to go on to live a long and fulfilling life as a free person in the Jewish state. And Gadi, again, Moses, he's 80 years old, and they put together a whole geriatric unit just to try to protect him. At any rate, to get him back into the line of health at the age of 80 after almost 500 days in captivity of Hamas. And I think when we look at this, we see what evil looks like. This is the same Palestinian lynch mob. This Palestinian lynch mob around Arad and Gadi is the same Palestinian society that invaded Israel following Hamas's initial invasion on October 7, 2023. They came in armed with hatchets and torches and axes, and they burned Israelis alive, and they kidnapped them, and they raped the women, and they mutilated the bodies, not just Hamas, but also these civilians, these innocent civilians that are the same people that are surrounding Arad and Gadi in Gaza as they're taking their final steps towards freedom. And on the other hand, you see these innocent hostages, and you see the society that was willing to do anything in order to save them, and that's Israel. When we look at Arad, we understand how important it was for us to stop for a second, pause in the fighting in order to get out as many hostages alive as we possibly can, because this is this is the face of evil that is holding them. And so if there are people that are alive there, then we have to get them out. And, we should recall the Bibas family, Shiri Bibas and her children, her small boys, Kfir, he was only 10 months old when they were taken hostage, and Ariel, who was 4. And apparently they're not among the living, otherwise they would have already been let out. That means that they were murdered, that family was murdered by Hamas. That's essentially what we're seeing here today. It's not official, but the facts is that we're moving to the men, to the releasing of men, because the live hostages are supposed to be released first in this deal. And so that's a very sobering thought. But again, it goes back to who are these people who are waging war against Israel? Who are these people who are whooping and laughing and trying to kill the hostages in the last moments of their captivity in Gaza? And really on October 7th, we saw evil in the face, and we also saw good. We saw all of the Israelis individuals who went and risked life and many times lost their lives doing everything to rescue the people along the border with Gaza. We remember the heroes who came down as the IDF was paralyzed, or general staff was paralyzed, incapable of taking any concerted action. The Air Force wasted hours before they finally got into the air, and then they were ineffective. And then you had people like the Kalmanoviches who came down from their homes in the South Hebron Hills, and they saved 90 people in Be'eri on their own until I'm said Kalmanovich, I mean Kalmanson. Elchanan Kalmanson went down with his brother and their brother-in-law. They saved 90 people in Be'eri before Elchanan was killed. These were people who would be dead today had it not been for their heroism. And so many other individuals who came, they saw what was happening and they just came. They came with no arms and fought with their hands in order to save their brothers and sisters from the Holocaust that occurred that day on October 7th in the western Negev along the border with Gaza. And that's what happened that day, and they were supported and they were cheered on, and they were joined by Hezbollah, which started shooting Israel from Lebanon October 8th. And they were poised at the border to invade Israel with the capacity to actually seize control, conquer the large swaths of the Galilee down to the Gulf of Haifa. We saw the Houthis in Yemen who joined the fight and essentially placed a maritime blockade on Israel in the Red Sea. We saw the militias that are controlled by Iran in Iraq. We saw forces in Syria attacking Israel. And of course, we saw the Palestinians, the brethren of the monsters in Gaza, also expanding 4, 5, 10-fold their terrorist attacks against Israelis in Judea and Samaria, in the Sharon district, in the Gilboa district, in the days, weeks, and months following October 7th. And finally, of course, we saw the puppet master behind all of this, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the regime in Iran that funded, that trained, that stood behind the invasion of October 7th and the ring of fire, as they called it, of all of the terror forces arrayed against Israel on our borders, along our borders. And that was where we were on October 7th, with individuals coming down with the IDF high command in a state of shock and unable to operate in any coherent fashion until the evening of that day. And so people came. And we saw the heroism of the Israeli people in that day, and then in the days and the weeks, and the IDF, over 300,000 reservists just ran into the fire in order to defend our people, ran into Gaza in order to destroy this enemy. We saw acts of courage by our forces in Gaza that were unparalleled in any of the wars that Israel has fought since its establishment in 1948. As the living veterans of the War of Independence in 1948 tipped their hats to the young men and women fighting in Gaza today, they said that you are our equals. We have always upheld the generation of 1948, and here we see that the generation of 2023, 24, 25 has nothing to be embarrassed about. This generation of the iPhones and the internet that everybody thought was just interested in what they were looking on their screen, and they didn't care about the world around them, works out that you can do both. And they have been. So we have these Lions of Judah who are defending us in the IDF, who have fought so fiercely and so courageously that it takes your breath away. And been willing, many of them have been forced to make the ultimate sacrifice. We've lost 850 soldiers since the beginning of this war, and we've lost 405 soldiers in Gaza fighting this war on the ground, and more in Lebanon. So they have paid the ultimate price. Over 13,000 have been wounded in this war. And they keep going, and they keep wanting to fight more because they understand, just like the entire nation of Israel understands, that this is a war that we have to win. This is a war for our survival. And I've said this on this program to you guys many times. We saw what the end looks like on October 7th, and nobody wants to approach it again. We see the face of evil in our enemies and the way that they behave themselves, the freeing of especially Arad Yehud and Gadi Moses, but also with the theatrics, the theatrical production that they put on thanks to Al Jazeera reporters with the release of the female hostages, the IDF soldiers, with their staged ceremonies, which were so sick. And that's what we saw on October 7th, and since we saw the heroism of the Israeli people, we also saw the awakening of anti-Semitism worldwide. And in a way, it was shocking, the proportions, the level, the violence, the raw hatred that was exposed throughout the Western world, throughout the English-speaking world, United States and Britain and Australia, in South America, throughout Europe. And I guess we saw precursors to it, because every time there's a direct proportion between the lethality of the Palestinian assaults on Israel and the rise in anti-Semitism. So the highest peak that we had seen until October 7th and in the months following was in 2014 in our largest war until now with Hamas Operation Protective Edge. And there were mass pogroms in places like Paris, in the neighborhoods that are largely Jewish. They barricaded a synagogue. We saw many, many acts of anti-Semitism and unprecedented peaks in anti-Semitic violence in the West and in LA. We saw this was back in 2014 and on campuses. So it's not surprising that it happened. It's not surprising. So we're seeing a direct correlation between the level of lethality of Palestinian violence against Jews in Israel and the level of anti-Semitism worldwide. We would have thought that the world, that right-thinking people would recoil in the face of this kind of evil, but it works out that this kind of evil inspires hatred of Jews worldwide. And that's something I think that was a surprise for many Jews. I think it was a surprise for many Jews in the United States. I think it was a surprise for many Jews in Europe and in Australia again, that views that acts of wanton cruelty and sadism that we saw on October 7th wouldn't cause everybody to recoil or to be embarrassed if they did support the Palestinians from expressing that support. And it worked out that just the opposite was the case. And that was something that many, many people had a hard time getting their heads around, because it means that violence inspires. It means that people are different from what we thought that they were like, that some people run to evil, run towards it. They love it. They embrace it, particularly when it's directed, in this case, against the Jews. That the hatred of Jews is so enormous, so deep-seated that the wanton slaughter of Jewish families, rape of Jewish women, makes people excited, makes people want to express that they too hate Jews. And that was something I think that was notable. And again, just to go back, the other thing that was notable was the extraordinary resilience and courage of the Jewish people in the face of this hatred, that rather than hide, particularly in Israel, but also, I think that there were outstanding examples of that courage even in places like Harvard and Columbia, where the Jewish students refused to stand down. Now, some of them did hide, and reasonably, because the college authorities weren't protecting them. But we saw footage, these young women who wrapped themselves in the flags of Israel on the south lawn of Columbia University in the midst of this mob of Hamas supporters. I think that that was an extraordinary image of the courage of American Jews. And it was an arresting image and an important image that showed that no, when we're faced with this kind of anti-Semitism, not only in Israel, but around the world, that there are Jews who will stand up to it, and a lot of them, a significant number of them. So I think that that's also important to see, that we don't hide in the face of these kinds of onslaughts, in the face of this kind of hatred. I think that's very important. And then I'm going to move to page 2 of my notes. There is a sense when we saw the pictures in Gaza of the release of the hostages and the Palestinians moving north along the Netzarim corridor that so many soldiers, again, paid the ultimate sacrifice in order to seize control of during the course of the battles. There's a sense that, has this all been for naught? Are we giving away everything that we achieved in 15 months of war in order to reach this hostage deal? And so I think, first of all, it's important for us to look at the footage that came out yesterday. So if 2 days ago, the people were allowed to move to the north, move across the Netzarim corridor back to northern Gaza, a day later, we got this footage of people who had gone north, decided, oh, never mind, there's nothing to see here. It's all destroyed. We have nothing to do here. And they're moving back to the south. They're moving back to the area of Khan Yunis, to the Mawasi, where they had sought refuge during the course of the war. Gaza is destroyed. Northern Gaza is destroyed. There's nothing for them there. And so they're not going there, and they're asking to be allowed to leave Gaza, to resettle, to start their lives somewhere else. And I think that that's a very clear indication that no, the fighting is not for naught. To the contrary, Hamas knows how to put on a show. Al Jazeera certainly knows how to put on a show. That's all that Qatar does with Al Jazeera, is put on a show to make people think that jihad is on the march, that jihad is the greatest thing ever, and that they should all join the jihad. And so it's not surprising that they're able to put out this footage of the lynch mobs, of the stagecraft, of the fake stages and the fake ceremonies with the fake uniforms on our real soldiers who have been held in captivity by these monsters for nearly 500 years. It's not surprising that they know how to put on propaganda shows, because propaganda is an integral part of their terrorist war against the Jewish people. That's not surprising. But the fact is that Hamas has been decimated in this war. And the forces that are showing their faces, that are now running around and parading with these uniforms, they're not the core of the Hamas fighters that invaded Israel on October 7th. It's true, this is a jihadist society, and they're going to continue fighting Israel to their last breath, because that's all that they're organized to do as a society. This society itself is evil. It's true, but it's also true that they're nowhere near as strong as they were on October 7th. And the Hezbollah that was perched on Israel's borders on October 7th and capable of invading and conquering the Galilee no longer can invade Israel. They're not in a position to invade Israel. And their missile forces are not an existential threat to Israel the way that they were perceived to have been on October 7th. Hezbollah has been decimated by our forces over the past summer. And I think it's important to realize this. The threat that we face, the threat that we suffered from when it was actually implemented on October 7th from Gaza, is not the threat that Gaza poses today. Is the war won? No. But have we accomplished great things during the course of the fighting? Yes. So what are we doing now? What is this ceasefire? Well, this ceasefire is in order to implement the second goal of the war, which is to free the hostages. And that's what we're doing now. So we're taking, Hamas is down, but we stopped the count, right? We stopped it in the ceasefire, and as soon as the ceasefire ends, we're going to go back and we're going to destroy them. And I think that it's important to know that Iran is not the same actor that it was on October 7th. Its ring of fire is all but doused, right? The Trump administration now, I'm sure they just restored the Houthis standing as a foreign terrorist organization. One of the first acts, of course, that former President Biden did upon taking office was he removed the Houthis from the terror list. removed all the sanctions on the Houthis. Well, those are back now because the Trump administration, because President Trump rightly put them back on the terrorist list. And that's going to impose a lot of different consequences on the Houthis that they didn't face under the Biden administration, which refused to take any concerted action against either Iran, which it appeased and enabled as a result to organize and carry out the October 7th invasion and assault and war. But they wouldn't take any action against Hezbollah or the Houthis or any of Iran's other proxies, right? And so they had a free rein under the Biden administration that they lost on November 5th and particularly on January 20th. And as soon as President Trump came into office, he started restoring the sane policy that he had enacted to in such a successful way until he left office in 2021. So I think, that also is something that we're seeing. And finally, I just want to talk about another major force that has enabled Israel to get where it is, including seeing the release of the female hostages, and that's Prime Minister Netanyahu. Prime Minister Netanyahu is the lion in winter. He is a leader who is an older man. He's 75 years old, and he almost single-handedly, at least from the leadership perspective, has led Israel in this war. And against everything, against our deep state, against the defeatist generals in the IDF that have insisted that it's impossible to win. And all they wanted was a ceasefire almost from the outset of this war to get the hostages home, the hostages that were taken because they were asleep on October 7th. And he forced the IDF general staff, the leader of the general staff, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, to take all of the actions that Israel took, taking over Khan Yunis, taking over Rafiah, pulverizing northern Gaza, decimating Hezbollah's leadership, the beepers, and assassinating Hassan Nasrallah. All of these things were done because of Prime Minister Netanyahu, and they were done in the face of opposition from the most anti-Israel American administration we've ever faced, the Biden administration, which made us fight this war with both hands tied behind our back by forcing us to resupply Hamas from the outset of the war under the fake name humanitarian aid, kept them resupplied, kept them in charge of Gaza because they're in charge of distributing food and water and medicine and anything else that they're able to bring in, cigarettes. And they kept Hamas in the black financially because they were able to sell all of this stuff and able to maintain itself as the leader because they were resupplied constantly. They imposed embargoes on us. They green-lighted ICC action against Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, issuing arrest warrants against them as if they're the moral equivalent of Yahya Sinwar and the other butchers in Hamas. They placed an arms embargo on Israel. They slow-walked ammunition, the tank shells, the artillery shells, the Air Force ordnance throughout the war to make it impossible for Israel to get that kill shot in. And still we got kill shot after kill shot after kill shot. And because we had a prime minister with dogged determination not to abandon the fight, to keep fighting, to keep winning, and to destroy this machine of jihad that Iran has erected and that they built, that they constructed in Gaza, in Lebanon, Judea and Samaria, in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, in Iran itself. And I think that you can't understand, this war without recognizing that it has been Prime Minister Netanyahu has been leading it. And so now we're in this sort of pause in the war to get as many of the hostages out as possible. And again, Arad Yehud, thank God she was set free today after unspeakable horror that she's underwent since October 7th. And we're getting to the point where we're going to have to reach that decision of how we proceed after we see that the price of maintaining the ceasefire outweighs the benefit of maintaining the ceasefire, of getting out the hostages. And we remain determined to achieve the goals of the war, the first and the third, which are annihilating Hamas as a military threat, as a political entity and as a military force, and then finally preventing Gaza from ever posing a threat to Israel again. And that brings us to what's going to be happening next week, which is that Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to be flying to Washington to meet with President Donald Trump for the first time since Trump returned to office on January 20th. And by the way, we should note, as the White House did in its official invitation to Netanyahu, that Netanyahu will be the first foreign leader to have an official visit in the White House since President Trump returned to office 10 days ago. So I think that's also important to note because Biden refused to meet with Netanyahu. Netanyahu formed his government, returned to office in December of 2022. And President Biden refused to meet with him until September 2023. And even then, he refused to host him at the White House. They saw each other in some sort of hotel complex in New York at the site of the UN General Assembly meeting that was taking place there. So that Biden boycotted Netanyahu. And was working avidly with the deep state here, with the left here, which was in a civil war essentially against the government and its supporters from January 2023 until October 7th. And they've renewed their operations if they ever stopped them since. But in recent months, but you see that Trump, unlike Biden, is not interested in overthrowing the government of Israel and is not tying the hands of the IDF in fighting this war or trying to criminalize Israel for fighting this war the way that the Biden administration did already from the outset in its opening statements after October 7th, when they said, you better abide by the laws of war when you prosecute the fight in this war, meaning we assume that you won't, and therefore we're issuing this finger-wagging warning to you from the outset. So we're looking at a different situation. What has Trump done just in the past 10 days? So he ended the arms embargo, of course, and he, let me just see, he announced perhaps the most important policy recommendation that any president of the United States has issued in relation to the Palestinians, which is that the people of Gaza should leave. They should seek refuge in Egypt, in Jordan, in any third country that will take them, because there's nothing for them in Gaza except continued war and hate and poverty and suffering. And when the Egyptians and the Jordanians said, no, Dice, we're not interested, he said, why? And he's not, and he's doubling down, and he's not letting go. And I think Aaron Buller is his name, his representative for the hostage talks, the president's, he was interviewed on Israeli television yesterday, Buller, and he said, well, if Egypt and Jordan won't take them, then they have to offer another suggestion for how to deal with the situation, meaning who will? What are they going to do? And so I think that's also important. So you're seeing the president saying, look, they can't remain there. This population, to the extent that it's deprived or it's suffering, then it should leave. And to the extent that it's not and it wants to continue war, then it should be forced to leave as well, because otherwise we're only going to have a continuation of this. And that kind of statement by the president is an important one because it opens up a whole venue for policymaking that was always closed under previous administrations. Under the Biden administration, we couldn't even talk about the day after the war because the only day after the war they were interested in was one that would lead to a Palestinian terrorist state being formed, not only reformed in Gaza, but expanded to Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem as well. And so we couldn't have a conversation about the day after because the only day after that the Biden administration was interested in was one that empowered the people who invaded Israel on October 7th, who made it clear that they're not willing to ever peacefully coexist with the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And so we couldn't have that discussion, and now we're going to have that discussion. And that brings me really to what we're facing. So on Tuesday, Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to be meeting with President Trump at the White House. And these two leaders are going to have a lot to talk about. They're also having a working dinner, not just a meeting in the afternoon. And the reason for that is because Israel's operations in this war against Iran, against Hezbollah in Lebanon, against Hamas and its terror regime in Gaza, in Judea and Samaria, and in Syria, and what happened in Syria, the fall of Bashar al-Assad and the rise of a Turkish and Qatari-based Daesh, ISIS regime in Damascus, all of these things are transformative. It's not that the Middle East is going to be at peace necessarily, and probably it won't be when this war is won. But what we're facing, we're in a moment where we're about to win this war against Iran and its terror axis. And that war has to be won in a convincing fashion in order for Israel, with the backing of its ally, the United States, to be in a position to contend with the next act in this global jihad, which is going to see the rise of the Sunni axis led by Turkey and Qatar, and with the cooperation to one extent or another of Egypt. Because you have President al-Sisi, who has been threatening war with Israel over the issue of will the Gazans be removed from Gaza or not. And I think that this is very important. Sisi has remilitarized the Sinai Peninsula. He's training his army for war against Israel. He's receiving a lot of, funding, and he's making good ties with Erdogan and with the Qataris. And there's a question of what Egypt is going to do. That question will be answered in large part by how this war ends. So here, too, in order to prevent another war, Israel has to be seen as convincingly and inarguably having defeated Hamas in this war, having defeated the complex of terrorism, the society of terrorism in Gaza in this war. And again, that's why President Trump's resettlement option of the Gazans is so key here to minimizing bloodshed, while at the same time maximizing the apparent nature, the obviousness of Israel's victory. So I think that this is a key component, and because to the extent that Israel wins this as convincingly as possible, the possibility of another war breaking out is diminished, and I think that that's also very important. And again, we had 4 years where the United States, while paying lip service to the U.S.-Israel alliance, was actually working to undermine that alliance day and night in the actions that it took, in the concerted actions that it took, like the arms embargo, like green lighting the kind of international organizations' actions against Israel by criminalizing our military effort in Gaza and trying to undermine our operations in Lebanon and obviously in Judea and Samaria throughout the past 15 months. And now we're moving to a situation where we have a new administration with Marco Rubio at the State Department, Pete Hegseth at the Defense Department, Elise Stefanik at the United Nations, and on and on and on, who are going to be advancing President Trump's agenda of peace through strength. And that, I've expressed fears about, the enthusiasm that some of the people in the Trump administration have expressed about the ceasefire and the seeming lack of understanding about what's at stake. And the reason for that is not because I think, God forbid, that the Trump administration is similar to the Biden administration, but it's because I understand the stakes in this war, and I'm worried, and I want to make sure we win because I understand that everything is riding on that victory. So it's very important to be aware and to be concerned about anything that might diminish Israel's prospects of winning this war, because it's not possible for us to live in peace and security if we don't. So I think that it's more a sense of the absolute necessity of Israeli victory for Israelis that makes things disconcerting than it is the question about what the Trump administration thinks about Israel, because I think that's very clear that President Trump appointed all of these people because they reflect his positions on the Middle East, on the state of Israel, on American interests in the Middle East, on the things that affect America's national security in the Middle East, for better or for worse. So I think that this is going to be an historic meeting that takes place on February 4th at the White House, because you're going to see America's most powerful ally, arguably in general, but certainly in the Middle East, this hero of the Jewish people, this man who has been leading Israel in just a heroic way throughout this war, Prime Minister Netanyahu, sitting down with a President Trump that is unleashed by the massive, overwhelming victory that he won on November 5th, who understands just how devastating the past 4 years of the Biden administration has been, not only domestically, but also in terms of America's standing in the world. And they're going to be sitting down and they're going to be talking about a Middle East that has been transformed by this war, by the evil that we saw on October 7th and continue to see from the people of Gaza and from their supporters around the region, led by Iran, and then now in Syria and in Qatar and in Turkey as well. And we've seen the extraordinary courage, the goodness, the kindness of the Israeli people, of our soldiers and our officers. We're going to have an IDF led by a new commanding general at the end of February. We don't know who it is that's going to replace Herzi Halevi yet, but we know what kind of thinking has to be informing him as he goes forward, which is that the politicization that we saw of the IDF under Herzi Halevi and his predecessors, who are all in politics, all on the left, has to end. And that the IDF has to be a fighting force that's dedicated to one thing, which is destroying Israel's enemies. There's an interesting story that came out today. Yossi Yehoshua, the military affairs correspondent in I-24 News, he reported that he had spoken to a senior general in the Central Command who said, we have to set aside the fake idea that we have to wage war against Hamas and make peace with the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority enables Hamas. They work with Hamas, and we have to be able to recognize this. I don't know how it is that I believed the fable about the Palestinian Authority, but I've cast that aside, and we all have to cast that aside. It's not true anymore. The threat that the Palestinian security forces, the PA, Hamas terrorists, Islamic Jihad terrorists, posed to Israel is worse than what we faced from Hamas on October 7th in terms of their capabilities and the way that they can harm us. And that has to be the focus of our effort in the ground war in the months to come. That's an astounding statement by a senior officer in Central Command. We haven't heard anything like that for decades. So I think that you see an awakening not only among the Israeli public, but also in the high levels of the IDF, which is now poised to get a new commander, a new chief of general staff, who's going to have a different outlook on how we face our enemies than Herzi Halevi has, captivated as he was by the politicization of the general staff over the past generation and the support that it received from the Democratic administration, the Biden administration, before that, the Obama administration. So I think that we're going to see a very different Israel going forward. We're seeing a very different United States of America going forward. And I think that Israel and that America are going to join forces next week in that meeting at the White House. And we're going to be able to move in a way that's going to secure our future for freeing of the hostages, secure our future for winning this war. It's been a great privilege to be going through the past 15 months with you guys. I feel blessed that you always wanted to come and listen to me and watch this show. It's really been an amazing feeling for me knowing that I have this outlet at JNS to speak to you, to communicate the reality of life in Israel in this war to you through JNS. But now I'm going to be taking a break from these broadcasts to go and serve the state of Israel and the Jewish people in another way. Details to follow. And in the meantime, wish me luck. I wish all of you luck and Godspeed. I thank you again for your support for my work, but more importantly for Israel and for the Jewish people. God bless you, and Am Yisrael Chai.